Hello, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm sure
it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. You're so welcome in Ukraine in online format, and hopefully you will be also visiting Ukraine in offline format after we'll finish all this stuff happening in Ukraine. So introduce yourself a bit, and I'll turn on your presentation.
Great. So I'm Nikhil, head of strategy and innovation at the Celo Foundation. Essentially, I function as our head of ecosystem or Web3 ecosystem, and I work across our entire ecosystem, supporting projects on their launches, building out new use cases on the Celo blockchain, and essentially kind of supporting the ecosystem on their journey. For context, Celo is a mobile-first layer 1 blockchain that's EVM compatible. Our entire focus is on how do we build a regenerative economy. And so this includes, things such as climate finance, social impact use cases, and real-world use cases. And so that's basically what Celo is, but I'll go into it further in my presentation as well, and open to any questions or comments that people have as well. So looking forward to this.
Okay, you're welcome. The audience is yours.
Amazing. So what I'll talk about today is building a regenerative economy with blockchain technology. So what does a regenerative economy mean, and how can a blockchain technology essentially facilitate the development of that, both from a technical layer as well as a social layer? So the way we see this is that Web3 is a mass coordination tool for solving the world's most pressing problems. That's something that Web3 technology and blockchain technology that underlies it to be particularly effective at doing. And so for an example here is the Unchained Fund, which was used to pull together funds for Ukraine, actually, basically last year. And then similarly, you have groups like Redemption DAO, which was also predicated off of, inspired by Ukraine DAO. But in this case, it was how do you galvanize funds and action and narrative change for climate action, specifically when it was related to the Congo and forest land there. So when we say, okay, great, you have this opportunity for mass consensus prompts to build a regenerative economy, what does that mean? The way we frame it is that a regenerative economy is promoting a healthy planet, addressing social and wealth inequality, encouraging and fostering shared value, and empowering people and communities to thrive. It's kind of pulling together those 4 facets and how you can build out solutions to actually help make that possible. To start, the way that we've approached this is cultivating an ecosystem for a regenerative economic system. So how do we bring together key people and organizations and users to essentially galvanize it and actually say, we're going to build this all together? Obviously, from a blockchain standpoint, it's not that it's any one centralized group, but rather it's bringing together people from all around the world with different facets and different components for all of this. So the way we approached it was you have to start with some type of technology stack. And in our case, it was a proof of stake EVM chain. The emphasis here was, it was forking Ethereum, but then making tweaks to it and changing it for a few key pieces. One was at that time being proof of stake, given the nature for climate. But then also thinking about if you're trying to have it easy for everyday users, having it so that you have 5-second finality, having something that's very low fee, to make all of this possible. And I'll go into a little bit more detail later on in terms of what are some of the core infrastructure pieces for that, and what were the use cases we were really thinking about. But it's starting, for when we think about bringing together and creating an ecosystem, it's having a blockchain that essentially facilitates that. From there, it's innovating with inflation. So when we think of our epoch rewards for the actual token supply, you're rewarding, of course, your stakers. That's standard, as well as validators. But there were a few additional components here. One was epoch rewards and transaction fees going towards a community fund that's governed by the ecosystem. So it's not something that's governed by the Celo Foundation, but how do you have it so that people who are part of that ecosystem have access to funds that they can direct and use? So this could be for something like community funds for grants for projects that are building. It could be research grants. It could be to build community in different parts of places. It could be to create DAOs. We've had a few different DAOs that have been created specifically for community funds or utilizing community funds. Then you have what was a carbon offset fund. Sorry. This was the first governance proposal that was passed by the Celo ecosystem when the Celo blockchain went live. The carbon offset fund was basically a question of how can we, at a blockchain level, essentially make sure that our blockchain is carbon neutral or even carbon negative. In that case, it's not something that's necessarily managed by multi-sig or something like that, but from a governance standpoint, how can you have it so that epoch rewards are directly sent to what is a separate fund that's utilized for climate action? And in our case, early on in 2020, when we first launched it, it was a offsetting for the entire ecosystem through REN. For those of you who don't know, REN is essentially an off-chain provider for carbon offsets. And what REN did was they basically created a wallet on chain, and a certain portion of epoch rewards were sent to that REN wallet, and then REN off-chain would do whatever specific offsets based off of kind of the standards and methodologies that they were using. That was in 2020. And if you can, as we look to continue build out a kind of how we thought about from a regenerative ecosystem, it was also honing in further on climate use cases and actually scaling that. And so I'd mentioned earlier this community fund that the ecosystem governs. In this case, the next one was launching the Climate Collective, which is essentially a group of consortium of organizations and stakeholders, all who are looking at building kind of climate action solutions on Web3 technology. And so these are things such as carbon credit assets, project financing for renewable energy, research, digital measurement reporting and verification for different climate assets. But the key piece here being, again, it was an ecosystem of people who are coming together around a technology structure. And then again, then it's taking it from there. So from a climate action standpoint, for the Celo blockchain, offsets were being done through the carbon offset fund through REN, which is off-chain. The question then is can you also start looking at utilizing on-chain assets? And I would say, of course, I don't think most of the on-chain assets are super high quality, which of course is something to consider. And so it was, how can you bring together a group to essentially start thinking about, hey, we can start doing a small portion of the overall blockchain's carbon offsets on chain. The rest of it is you're still more than covering it with off-chain components, but then if you can start incorporating the small on-chain. And so in this case, it was how do you have, working with a group like the Rocky Mountain Institute for a framework, and then from there, a few set of individuals who are managing a multi-sig to just do that specific action for on-chain offsets, because that requires a bit of a manual process. That being said, that's going to change in the next few months, where even you get rid of the multi-sig members. And again, it's just fully automated because you have a few key protocols that facilitate the whole thing. So again, it's from there, but it's bringing in relevant people. So Climate Collective, Mercy Core Ventures, Spirals, which is a project that came about through support from the Climate Collective. So it's always, how do you continue creating an ecosystem around it? And then most recently, again, when we think of a blockchain, it's how do we kind of continue that in terms of having overall governance and consensus around it? So right now, that carbon offset fund, you have epoch rewards. The next thing was launching ultra green money, which is essentially how you could have at the native level, even the transaction fees, some of it going into carbon offsets and climate action. And what specific assets that are used for climate action, whether that's carbon offsets or funding to different sources, that's determined by the ecosystem. The ecosystem says, hey, we think that this is what we should fund. It's not determined by the multi-sig. It's not determined by the Celo Foundation, but it's actually utilizing a blockchain at the very base layer for at least one form of consensus of, hey, this is where funding should go for climate action based on the epoch rewards that the Celo ecosystem essentially governs. And so recently we launched Ultra Green Money, which is a play on ultrasound money on Ethereum, but with a slight twist. The first one is that you still have, your epoch rewards, but then for transaction fees, a certain portion of it is basically burned, and another portion of it is essentially sent to the carbon offset fund. So if in every transaction, some portion of Celo that's paid, that's usually paid, goes to a carbon offset fund. And then here, if you look on the right, that carbon offset fund is currently managed by a multi-sig simply on behalf of the ecosystem, where the ecosystem says, hey, we want you to right now do 80% of your offset with REN, 20% of it by purchasing and retiring toucan. Later on, we'll look at something like Senkin, which will automate that. So you completely get rid of that carbon offset fund multi-sig. And then instead, you just have the ecosystem saying, we want it to go here, we want it to go here, and they vote in governance, and it essentially does a smart contract execution for that. So I talked about there of how, from a blockchain standpoint, it can be used to kind of build consensus and create ecosystems. But then similarly, it's of course building a blockchain that's designed for solving those real world problems. If you don't have that, it becomes very difficult. And so the real problems we were looking at, and our ecosystem has been looking at, is early on, it started out with things such as humanitarian aid and payments. As we saw the kind of development of DeFi and NFTs, it was looking at real world lending and climate finance. And then more recently, we've started seeing a number of utility NFTs and things such as customer loyalty by enterprises as a way to also kind of galvanize their customers around like planet positive behavior. In the first case, it started with having a mobile-first EVM chain. I'm sure many of you would know what that would mean. Of course, having kind of an ecosystem of mobile dApps. It's basically, can you design a blockchain that operates well for phones? And phones, not just your latest iPhone or your latest Samsung, your Android phone, but one that is able to operate even in low bandwidth or with older phones. And so for that, it was using zero knowledge proofs and zero knowledge technology to essentially make that possible. For our case, the technology is called Plumo. And then it's having stable value currencies that can actually be used to pay for gas. So at the very beginning for the Celo blockchain, it was not that only your native token can be used to pay for gas. The stable coins on Celo could also be used to pay for gas. That's particularly crucial from a payment standpoint, or a lot of the use cases we focus on in emerging markets. And when we say a mobile first approach, it's also the ability to send currency to phone numbers. And so, for example, if I'm to send someone money, I could have their account address. I could also just have their phone number. And so I simply have to type in their phone number, and that will send the money over to them. And if they don't have an account address, if they don't have a wallet yet, they'll receive a text message with that money in escrow. And then when they create their account, that money will then transfer. On Celo, in this case, the way we make that possible from a phone number system is a decentralized mapping between phone numbers and account addresses. So it's rather than having a centralized group hold that, you can actually have a mapping system that's decentralized, which is much more secure. But this is really important from a usability standpoint, because sending money just by an account address isn't always something that's very feasible or easy to understand, especially when their kind of account addresses are very long. And we have identity protocols that have made that easier. But even then, can you send it to a phone number for something that just so much of us have grown up using? And then the other really crucial component is on and off ramps. If you're forced to sit only in crypto world, it's very difficult to kind of hit everyday use cases. So we've spent a lot of time investing in having on and off ramps around the world and having multiple sources. So it's not just your kind of tier one global partners such as like MoonPay or Ramp, which of course that's important, but even having local on and off ramps that can oftentimes offer lower fees, might actually be a bit more effective and have fewer bugs in different parts of the world, such as especially when you're trying to integrate your identity, and even kind of speed, so speed to response and customer service. Some of them will also allow it so that they'll partner with mobile money solutions, so that you're not necessarily off ramping into a smartphone. You can even off ramp into a feature phone, so a phone with just text messaging. So in that case, then it's looking at what are like some of the major projects that are actually utilizing that technology for saying, hey, we can actually build something new. And when we think about tackling mass coordination problems, different projects are doing that and kind of building around that. So a few crucial ones that are doing really cool work. There's many more as well, but a few that that I can share here on this structure is Good Dollar, which has about 90,000 recipients of universal basic income. So it's a decentralized protocol that's essentially doing that. And then they're partnering with different protocols to offer additional solutions, such as savings, like a savings app, for example. Then Gainforest is creating employment opportunities for measurement, reporting, and verification of climate assets. So an example is we did a project with them in the Philippines where they have people who are going out and collecting mangrove reforestation data. That data is fed into carbon credit issuers and other groups in other parts of the world. But in this case, the Gainforest and crypto is essentially facilitating the payments through stablecoin. It's instantaneous. It's really fast. It's delivered on a mobile network essentially, and so that's quite powerful from an employment standpoint. And so Gainforce is continuing to do that with other blockchains as well. But they're thinking about how can we make the flow of money easier. Another project we did was with Mercy Corps, Cinch, and Kotani Pay. In this case, what Cinch is doing, it's an agriculture company in rural Kenya, and they wanted to make DeFi lending easier for their employees, and basically like not over collateralized, but under collateralized lending, because farmers in their network don't have access to traditional financial institutions. In a rural part, there isn't much, and any financial institution that might be there has very high interest rate. Like that would be something that's 30 to 40% just to borrow. So it's quite expensive. And so what we did with them is have it so that the employer is able to back their loans, back the employee's loans. And then from there, the employee kind of requests a loan, they get it, and it's deposited into their feature phone. It's not on their smartphone. And so when we were doing this, it was raining outside and I couldn't even access the internet from my phone because there was no data. But text messaging, of course, works. So the farmers would send text message. The text message would go and essentially ping the Celo blockchain. And from there, that loan would then be sent over to them through M-Pesa, which was then deposited into their M-Pesa wallet on their phone. In the case that they default, the actual employer is the one who's backing their loan. And so the employer basically garnishes their wages in the case that the employee doesn't pay back. So in this case, you created a model for community-based finance in which someone is able to access global capital markets for a loan in a place that they wouldn't be able to without even realizing that they're using crypto rails. It was something that did not look like crypto at all. It was just, hey, I'm able to access a loan through a text message from my phone. And then taking that a level further, when we look at how do we actually enable access to capital anywhere around the world, particularly when it comes to lending. So Ethic Hub is partnering with farming communities, particularly in Latin America, and providing loans. So it's crowdfunding. So anyone here can basically go to the Ethic Hub platform and provide a loan, and that's directed towards farmers. And then you earn a return. It's basically your assets are locked up for a period of time, and then you earn a return. But it's partnering with those groups and having it so that, hey, we actually know who they are. So the interest rates are pretty good, but the default rates are very low because you're able to kind of see the transparency in terms of what are they working on and what's their likelihood for defaulting. A few other larger projects. So we've been working with the Grameen Foundation, which does microloans. And so for them, they have these microfinance institutions in different parts of the world, and they need collateral as they're doing their microloans. So how can a blockchain be used to bring capital from all around the world to service microloans and microfinance? So in different parts of the world, a microfinance institution may actually it might be difficult for them to get capital from other institutions because of where they're located, because of capital markets. But in this case, crypto and stablecoins can basically be used for that. And they may not even need to off-ramp in some of these instances. They're just holding it as collateral for their reserve, just as someone who's kind of doing lending. Then there's two projects I want to flag here. One is on the slide, but another one is one focusing in Eastern Europe. So this one is Untangled Finance, which is focusing on securitization for green bonds and climate infrastructure. And then another more recent project is called Gigawatt. Some of you guys may know of them. They're focusing on debt markets for renewable energy sources. So the project financing and essentially infrastructure financing for renewable energy. I know they're working with different energy providers in Eastern Europe, but it's again, how can capital flow from around the world for financing for renewable energy here, which is quite powerful. NFTs similarly are a really cool way of galvanizing community and building awareness and narrative change. And so we've had different NFT projects that are, bringing resources for climate action or humanitarian aid through art and narrative change. We also have like move to earn platforms that are saying, how can we incentivize the use of public transit, for example, rather than people taking ride share or taking their own personal car. And so the rewards here are, as you're moving and utilize public transit, they've partnered with city governments. From there, it's how can you then provide discounts or other types of rewards for people who are using public transit. And in this case, it's something that, so I take a lot of public transit, and it's something that's a powerful mechanism of both linking startups and blockchain technology to public services. You increase the use of public services, so that's good for a city, as well as you're kind of thinking about it from like, what is the opportunity for a climate standpoint, or opportunities for more like shared resources across cities. And then all of this can also be tied to an identity system that's kind of tied to impact. So you can actually create an impact identity. So we've had a few groups such as Massa Finance that's creating an impact identity and then partnering with different groups. Blockchain technology, lastly, is like quite powerful to create more transparent voluntary markets. This is, for carbon credits, it's price transparency. Normally, carbon credits are essentially sold by centralized brokers. So for institutions, it's very opaque in terms of what that pricing is. But blockchain technology is really good at pricing transparency. If we look at different carbon credit assets, when they're put onto something like a Uniswap, that's that pricing is basically set by the market, and you can see it. From a traceability standpoint, carbon offsets, this has been a huge problem in the climate finance industry, is how do you know if you're doing an offset, if that offset is real or not? From a traceability standpoint, groups like Gainforest are actually collecting that data and linking it to that underlying asset. And Carbon Path is another really good project for that, where they're focusing on oil well shutdowns. And they have all the data, the live data, they have satellite imaging of those specific sites, and they're collecting all that, and it's directly linked to that carbon credit asset itself that's on chain. And then it can be, you have other mechanisms for climate finance solutions, which is only possible through a smart contract. So this is such as being used for collateral or having designs for crowdfunding or royalties to the originator. And that way it's a mechanism in which you can actually have different people get money for creating those assets, rather than just a centralized institution. So how can that money be better dispersed out to different people who are the ones who are really doing that type of work? So then putting all of that together, it's that the Celo blockchain, or any blockchain, can function as both a technical and a refi social consensus layer. And so what that means, it's bringing in different groups like the ones I mentioned, along with other Web2 entities. How can they together work to create a regenerative economy? How can they work together when it comes to humanitarian aid or social impact use cases or new impact finance solutions? It's not like any one group. It's creating an ecosystem for that for an entire industry, to actually create tangible change. And so, it's bringing in different people all around, having kind of different projects. And then from there, how can you create a global diverse ecosystem? So it's not just predicated in one part of the world, but can really be truly global. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you so much for having me. If there's any time for questions, open to taking that, but I appreciate you listening in. You might be muted.
I'm sorry. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the presentation and say how impressed I was. You're doing a great job, really, and your project, like doing so much good things. It's very important as for me, because lots of projects doing different stuff, but you're doing like pure good, which can really improve the world, make the world better. So appreciate your work very much. And by the way, it's interesting that you mentioned Gigawatt. We know that, guys, because
Nice.
the moderators, previous CJ and Rev, are also involved in this project, like in advisors, or maybe even more than advisors. And I'd like to say that there are a lot of companies like alternative energy and just companies which are productive companies which are interested in ecological things. The market is very big here in Ukraine, and the companies understand the importance of these things. And I guess because my question was how to boost Web3 in Ukraine, and the ecological sector is one of the most important things, because the interest is from very big companies, and they can move ecology, move economy. So maybe you can also share your ideas about how to boost Web3 in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. When you think of larger companies being interested in that and an opportunity there, that's exactly what the team at Gigawatt also identified, and we were talking about, I think it was earlier this week. But I think that's right. And so we've seen other projects do that. So Colectivo is another organization that's focusing on island nations and how can they build kind of a regenerative economic system. And they're building it around a community currency along with other data pieces. And it's a similar question of, they know that there's larger company interest in terms of some of these types of climate finance pieces. And so that being used as a mechanism to bring capital from other places. It can be quite powerful in terms of where funding flows, where financing flows. And I think we're only going to see more of that, because I think there's more and more of a need for money that's that's kind of allocated and provided for kind of different energy sources, given kind of like the climate crisis around the world. And we're only going to see that further. So I think that's right. And we've seen a number of enterprises who've been looking at this deeply.
And the second question I want to ask is about the regulation, because you work with different companies in different countries, and you understand the different influence or impact of regulation of different countries on the business, on crypto. So maybe you can share which legislation or which country the best in this case, maybe something we can in Ukraine look for some example or something like that, because it's very important for us at this time. We're just on the stage of creating this regulation, and we would like to take best from all over the world.
Yeah. So places that we found to be at least so for the Celo blockchain, we kind of leave it up to the ecosystem, but organizations that have operated, the places that they're particularly operating in are, places such as Europe. I think I've heard like Mika has been helpful for some projects as they've been trying to navigate kind of the regulatory environment and have clarity. Singapore is another part of the world where they've done a lot of kind of different thinking around regulation. Those are places that I think have done a lot of work, and places that it's different components. So I think there's different facets to this in terms of how far along are they in terms of regulation. So maybe, it's regulation for on and off ramp providers. That could be one. But then they may not have a lot of things around stable coins, which is a different component of regulation. And so it sort of depends. But then, of course, when we look at like the heavy use areas for the Celo ecosystem are Latin America and Africa. And that's completely different. Brazil has been quite proactive. So earlier, the Celo ecosystem had done a hackathon with the Central Bank of Brazil for thinking about tokenization of real-world assets. And that was something the Brazilian Central Bank was particularly interested in. And so I think those are kind of places that also are doing pretty interesting things. So it's Europe, Western Europe, Singapore, Brazil, probably Kenya a little bit as well.
Okay. Thank you so much one more time for your presentation and for all you're doing. You're really doing a great job. I hope that we will meet in person after the war will finish, and you're always welcome to Ukraine. We will be waiting for you here on our offline events. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.